Hello and welcome to tonight's Fireside Chat with Lynn and LaRouche for Thursday, July 7th. For those who would have been with us on Sunday, July 3rd, you know that we did a special intervention into the 4th of July. And it was done on the 3rd of July, which turned out to be a very good thing. The nature of the intervention was to commemorate the Declaration of Independence made on, or first presented on July 4th, 1776, by imitating it. And what we did was to present what was called a petition. It was very much in the form of the Declaration, which was a call for an ad hoc committee for a new Bretton Woods system. Now, right now, we don't need to go through this. You can refer to this or see this by going to the Schiller Institute site and our TLO site. But the purpose of our doing the January 3rd presentation was to demonstrate how to do what was done when the country was formed. And there's a reason that this became particularly significant. We didn't anticipate it, but with the shooting that occurred on July 4th, our presentation of July 3rd set both the context and the basis for addressing the actual matter of what occurred. That is, there was a seizure or an attempt to seize from the American people the July 4th holiday, sort of in the image of the kind of thing that happened, of course, on 9/11, not the same scale, but with the same sort of psychological impact. And this was aimed particularly at young people, such that no or little discussion of the actual declaration, no or little discussion about the nature of the process of forming the United States would happen. And instead, everyone would be plunged into some sort of timeless discussion about whatever the latest atrocity was. There is nothing special. What happens is everything becomes banalized into nihilistic responses or reactions to an event intended to have precisely that effect. When some of us were asked what should be said about that attack, we said, go to the event we did on Sunday and show that event to people, or take up the matters involved in that event, which is exactly the advice we would give people who want to talk to us about our view of Roe v. Wade, or our view about the EPA decision of the Supreme Court, or our view about this or that or the other. Because what has to be done is to reassert the identity of the United States, what the United States is, and therefore who people actually are. Now, this is not something that is arbitrary. This is not something that is simply up to everybody to decide. Well, it's up to everybody to decide who they are. No, it is not. Why is that the case? Well, for example, you don't choose the fact that you, if you're born in America, speak English. More importantly, you didn't invent the English language. So actually, the whole way you understand and communicate in the world is not, in fact, up to you. You may be able to take that tool and the ideas expressed in that tool, and you can therefore do things within that context and from that standpoint. But the very idea you have about how ideas work, if you are a native-born English speaker and an American English speaker, means that you only express yourself in a certain way. I'm not talking about literacy or illiteracy. I'm talking about saying anything about anything. This is an important conception to start with, because there is this premise that's being pushed by people. I can be anything I want. I can think anything I want. I can do whatever I want. That's called freedom. That's called liberty. And that's what the United States was about. The United States was about no such thing. And Americans are not American for any such reason. This is a republic, not a democracy. It is premised on a very specific revolutionary change that occurred in the 18th century. It was something that was organized over a long period of time in this country. And in the period of the 1980s in particular, we did a lot of work to try to make that history available to people. I'll cite something that I will later discuss, but I want to stop my remarks here because I want to get to the topic. There's a book that's written called How the Nation Was Won, America's Untold Story, Volume 1, 1630 to 54. Later on, I'll refer to an introduction done by LaRouche. It was written by H. Graham Lowry, who was a member of our organization, a leader of our organization, a major American historian, one of the finest of American historians. But he distinguished himself by an original discovery of how this country was created, and a figure that you've never even heard about named Alexander Spotswood. Right now, we're not going to talk about or go into that per se. But the reason I'm referencing this is because Graham became a very important teacher to myself and the two individuals we're going to be hearing from tonight. Back in 1987 in particular, in New Hampshire, when Graham gave a set of classes on the book, the book that was being released, How the Nation Was Won, and then subsequent work that he was also doing. That was distinct, that he made it come to life. And what the distinctive issue is in America today is that you must make the American Revolution come to life, not have people try to study it, which is always a useful thing, not have people try to commemorate it, which is a useful thing. You have to have people bring it to life. And if you do not do that, you can do nothing in this country whatsoever to stop its present form of disintegration, because it is disintegrating precisely because people have refused to bring the American Revolution to life. If you don't bring it to life, then it dies. So with that said, I'm going to introduce Chris Sare, who will get us started, and then we'll go to Bob. We may have a somewhat truncated or shortened discussion tonight. We have to see in terms of our schedule capabilities. So I'm going to ask people to pay very close attention to what's about to be said. Any questions, however, that people have, if we don't get to them tonight, we can certainly refer them to the two presenters to be answered. So, Chris?
Yep. You can hear me all right?
Yes, you're very clear.
Great. Well, so you mentioned Graham's book, and I wanted to sort of set the stage of the American Revolution and the whole fight over the question of a government that's powerful enough to promote the general welfare of the people, as the Constitution says. There's something different about our nation than any other nation. And, there's a lot of people who consider themselves patriots or right-wingers or whatever, however they want to label themselves, and they will readily agree to that. Oh, yeah, it's the best country. We're better than everybody else. Best country that's ever been created. And then you have people on the left who say it's a tyrannical country. Look what it's done. Look at slavery. Look at the wars. Look at these things. So, there's these two views, both of which are wrong. Because the point about the point about being a citizen is that in this republic is that you're responsible for where the country goes and what it does. There's this famous quote, "My country, right or wrong," and people leave it there, kind of like only reading a little bit of the Frederick Douglass speech, "What to the slave is the 4th of July." Well, what he actually says is, "My country, right or wrong, if right to be kept right, if wrong to be made right." So I just wanted to give people a sense of the beginning of the nation before it was a nation. What Graham goes through is the question of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and you have John Winthrop and his famous idea of a city on a hill, which is that the United States has to become a city on a hill that others will look up to. That's a very high standard for a nation. So the idea wasn't that we'd go around and clobber countries and beat them up until they came around to our point of view or adopted our system, but that rather we were a city upon a hill that nations could look to and say, wow, that's what we want to be, And what were the key things that Winthrop and later on the Mathers did in the Massachusetts Bay Colony? Well, they were insistent upon creating a sovereign currency. A currency and a credit system was actually developed by the Massachusetts Bay Colony first. And what did they do with this credit? Well, they invested it. You have the pine tree shilling, which LaRouche used to talk about all the time as the example of a first sovereign currency. That there was nothing behind this currency other than the intention of the government to invest the currency into the development of the nation. And it worked. And they built the Saugus Iron Works, for example, which were the leading ironworks in the world. At its height, they outproduced England 8-1 in terms of iron. So that was the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and that basically was obliterated by the British Empire in the 1690s, and it took another 80 years before the American Revolution was fought and won. But during that period, you had a number of very, very important people who were born: George Washington, John Marshall, Alexander Hamilton. He wasn't born in the United States, but he came to the United States. And I want to tell you that the people that fought to create this nation, and I mean literally fought in the American Revolution, fought to create a federal government that was strong enough and big enough to uphold the Constitution. A lot of people on the right, on the so-called right, they are leery of government. A lot of people say, I don't like big government. I don't want big government in my life. Consider that to a large extent that's because in our lifetimes I mean, after John F. Kennedy, really, certain FDR, and then John F. Kennedy, government has been abusive, intrusive, breaking the Constitution, spying on Americans, abusing other countries, imposing arbitrary laws, arbitrary will. But that's not government. Government is what was created by the founding fathers to defend and protect the general welfare, the preamble of the Constitution. And what I wanted to give people a sense of a couple of the people that really fought for this. One was obviously George Washington, whose entire life was committed to freeing the colonies from the British Empire. I mean, from the 1760s, he began to really, really see on his farm the British system, and the fact that he was paying very dearly for finished goods coming from England, and the goods were becoming a lesser and lesser quality. I mean, they would send over the worst garbage, and he was paying more and more for it. So at a certain point, 1765 or so, Washington says, that's it. We're going to produce everything we need to produce here in the colonies. We're going to produce our clothes. We're going to produce everything. I'm not going to buy anything from the British Empire anymore. So that's an important thought. That's obviously, 10 years before the Revolution, 10 years before he becomes the commander-in-chief. John Marshall, who was also born in Virginia, like Washington, Marshall is a very, very important and in my opinion, a very underrated citizen, a very underrated leader. Like Hamilton, who fought for the Constitution to be ratified in New York State, Marshall led the charge for the ratification of the Constitution in the state of Virginia. And, what he said, here's a quote from Marshall, and you see this clearly. I mean, three people that were in the Revolution, George Washington, John Marshall, Alexander Hamilton, they saw the absolute crisis that occurred during the American Revolution because of the lack of a strong central government to pay for the army, to make the weapons, you couldn't win this revolution on a states' rights basis. Sure, the states have rights. They will have rights, as the Constitution defines. But there had to be a national mission. And so what Marshall says in reflection on the American Revolution, he says, quote, "I partook largely of the sufferings and feelings of the army." He writes this to a fellow member of the Supreme Court, Joseph Story, later on in his life, and brought with me into civil life an ardent devotion to its interests. My immediate entrance into the state legislature opened my view to the causes which have been chiefly instrumental in augmenting those sufferings, and the general tendency of state politics convinced me that no safe and permanent remedy could be found but in a more efficient and better organized general government. So those are his reflections on why he fought for the Constitution. He says the grand object of the people to oppose successfully our British enemies and to establish on the firm base of certainty the independence of America. But a pettiness of little interests and passions produces such a distracted contrariety of measures that 'tis sometimes difficult to determine whether some other end is not nearer the hearts of those who guide our counsels. So these are his reflections on those who are opposed to the federal Constitution and a strong federal government. This is before the Constitution is ratified. He says, in April 1787, I was elected into the legislature for the county in which Richmond stands, and although devoted to my profession, entered with a good deal of spirit into the politics of the state. The topics of the day were paper money, the collection of taxes, the preservation of public faith, and the administration of justice. The state of the Confederacy was also a subject of deep solicitude to our statesmen. Mr. Madison was the enlightened advocate of union and an efficient federal government, but was not a member of the legislature when the plan of the Constitution was proposed to the states by the General Convention. It was at first favorably received, but Mr. Patrick Henry and Mr. George Mason and several other gentlemen of great influence were much opposed to it. In addition to state jealousy and pride, which operated powerfully in all large states, there were some unacknowledged motives of no inconsiderable influence in Virginia. In the course of the session, the unceasing efforts of the enemies of the Constitution made a deep impression, and before its close, a great majority showed a decided hostility to it. I took an active part in the debates on this question and was uniform in support of the proposed Constitution. So I just read you a few quotes from John Marshall there, who was successful in getting Virginia to ratify the Constitution despite the efforts of Patrick Henry. Give me liberty or give me death, Patrick Henry. Now, the Patrick Henry who fought against the Constitution said, if they can create a strong federal government, they can take your slaves away. So think about that. So for people who say, everybody, all the founding fathers were racist, they were all, rich, landholding racists, and that's what created the government. Well, no. I mean, Patrick Henry recognized that there was going to be a problem with this Constitution for the idea of the right to hold other human beings in bondage. He smelled a rat, and he was right, because the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, which promise that all men are created equal, that was the intention of this nation. That was the intention of this nation. So that's John Marshall, and he's gonna play an important role in a few minutes in this story. Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton was George Washington's aide de camp. He fought in the Battle of Trenton. He fought in a number of battles, and he was there at the surrender of Cornwallis in Yorktown. He fought in that battle and was there at the surrender. He was, but all along, all while this was going on, the American Revolution, Hamilton was completely preoccupied with how to create a sovereign currency and a credit system for the United States. Right? George Washington, I mentioned this in a presentation I did the other night. George Washington in 1783, after the defeat of the British in 1781 in Yorktown, but the peace had not yet been completely solidified. Washington is up in Newburgh, New York, on the Hudson. Where is he from? He's from Virginia. Is he only concerned about the development of Virginia? Absolutely not. He takes a tour in 1783 of the Mohawk River Valley and of the lakes going north from the Hudson River, and he says that God has given us a blessing, an area that cuts through the mountains. He was well aware of the problem of the mountains. Remember, Washington is a surveyor working with the Spotswood that Dennis mentioned. He's a surveyor with Lord Fairfax and others, and in Virginia, and he's at an early age, he is thinking about how do we get across the mountains there? How do we get across the Blue Ridge? How do we get across the Appalachians? How do we develop the interior of the United States? That's what he's thinking about as a young man. In the American Revolution, in the middle of the Revolution, he goes up and says, God has given us this potential to cut through the mountains. Would to God that we improve upon that. The idea of a canal. 1785, George Washington becomes the president of the Potomac Canal Company. He's working on projects to build canals, steamboats, the early steamboats of Rumsey. He's totally preoccupied with this, as well as the idea of creating a strong federal government, because he saw what happened with in the American Revolution. Hamilton saw what happened in the American Revolution. We just barely made it. We just barely won. Because they couldn't even, it was only because of people like Robert Morris who mobilized to get the funds to the Continental Army to be able to defeat the British. Right? So there were you couldn't just go to the States and say, hey, you want your freedom? Okay, well, cough it up. We need the money. You want to win this? And what Hamilton did, of course, was totally fascinating, because when he did as Treasury Secretary, when he did the assumption of the debt, the point was that the states that were the most in debt, they're in debt. Why are they in debt? Well, they're in debt because they're the ones that financed the revolution the most. So that's a little bit later, but Hamilton, he created this currency, this American sovereign currency, the dollar, and the idea of a credit system through the national bank. And people like Thomas Jefferson and, later Madison, who had written the Federalist Papers with Hamilton to create the Federal Republic, Madison completely bails and goes into a states' rights mode and says, you know what, I don't think the federal government has the power to do this. So this is the whole fight. Does the federal government have the power to do this? And what the Confederates basically say, the early Confederates, like Patrick Henry, hey, if you have the power to create a national bank, if you have the power to make internal improvements, then you have the power to take away my slaves, and I'm not going to stand for it. What a completely backward idea. So Washington and Hamilton convinces Washington or organizes Washington as Treasury Secretary once the Constitution is ratified. But Washington immediately goes with this idea of the national bank. And what Hamilton argues is that, look, it doesn't have to be specifically stated in the Constitution. It simply has to be necessary and proper. Necessary and proper, the necessary and proper clause in the Constitution. If it's not immoral and it's necessary and proper, then it's okay. We can do it. The federal government has the power to do it. We have the power to create a national bank. And so, people who like to rail against big government consider that the people that created this country understood we did have the necessary and proper reason to create a national bank. and to promote the internal improvements of the country. Now, I just wanted to say that I'm losing my voice. I'm not quite sure why, but John Marshall later on becomes the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and he upholds again and again in the Supreme Court McCullough versus Maryland. He upholds the national bank and the right of the federal government to create a national bank. In this case, the Second National Bank. He upholds the right of the government to create internal improvements. This is a huge fight. Well, I'm losing my voice. I don't know. I'm sorry. So I don't. Maybe Bob can take over here, but I wanted to just lay out to people that this is really the fight in the creation of the United States. That the people who then created the Confederacy and looked to rip it apart were the ones who always opposed this idea of the national bank and the internal improvements. And so the American people now have to decide, which side they're on and what they're going to fight for. So let me just leave it at that. I'll try to get my voice back, and Bob, take it away.
Okay. Can I be heard okay?
Yes.
Great. Okay. So just to underscore a couple things that Chris was saying, look, this is a battle to realize a form of government that was conducive to the actual nature of mankind, right, which is the power of reason, the power of creative reason, the power of cognition, and that was innate in every single human being. Now, this goes back to a battle in ancient Greece around Plato and Socrates, the early Christian movement. It explodes in the 15th century with the Italian Renaissance. And finally, you have with what Chris was mentioning with the Massachusetts Bay Colony, Winthrop and the people that came over here in the 1630s, they were very, very, very conscious that this is what they were out to do. They were coming to a completely new continent, no oligarchs, no kings, no queens, no dukes. It didn't matter at all who your parents were. You were something divine in the image of the Creator. And they were out to create a form of government that was conducive to that, completely revolutionary. And, they could do it here because you have some French running around and, some of them are nation builders. A lot of them are just killing beavers and selling fur. You have some Spanish here, but for the most part, the continent is empty. And that's the idea. That's the conception. So everything that's done is completely, utterly new. There's precedents of things that people have tried and ideas, a couple millennia of ideas to build on. But in terms of institutions, it's all completely new and totally revolutionary. Now, what I just want to go through briefly is one of these institutions that was completely designed by the Founding Fathers, by Hamilton, Washington, and others, which is the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, a military academy. Now, what was their idea? Exactly along the lines of what Chris went through, to build a nation, and not just the United States, but to build other nations. This is not, the idea was not, we need an army. Okay, let's build a military academy, and we'll teach people how to shoot guns and, march around and, some tactics and this and that. No, absolutely not. Right? Along the lines of what the intention of the new nation was, to represent and build upon this idea, a completely revolutionary institution was created. Now, this is something that Washington and Hamilton discussed directly during the Revolution. Finally, in 1799, Hamilton laid out in great, great detail the design of such an institution and what it would be. And if you read the curriculum that he has in there, I always laugh at this because there's not a lot of military stuff in it. okay, there's some gunnery and artillery science and stuff like this, but he calls it the fundamental school of the Academy of the U.S. Military Academy. What are they going to teach? Algebra, geometry, mechanics, geography, topography, chemistry, mineralogy, principles of construction, especially aqueducts, canals, and bridges, fluxion, that's calculus, conic sections, hydraulics, hydrostatics, pneumatics, and it goes on and on. It's a very lengthy, very, very detailed curriculum. And now, who do they choose to be for the first superintendent at West Point? You figure, well, maybe some big general from the American Revolution or something like this? No. They choose Benjamin Franklin's great-nephew named Jonathan Williams, who's not even a military person. Although I don't think he had any military experience, except he worked with Franklin during the war to procure armaments, a lot of it clandestinely from Europe to aid the American Revolution. But otherwise, he was known as a scholar and a scientist. And the first thing he does upon being appointed the first superintendent of West Point is he sets up something called the West Point Military Philosophy Society, right, along the lines of Franklin's American Philosophical Society. And he inherits all of the technical books. Franklin had probably the biggest library, he and James Logan, in the continent at that point. And all of the technical books, all of Franklin's philosophical books, etc. And so right off the bat, the West Point Military Academy becomes the biggest repository of technical and scientific books in North America, in the New World. Military Philosophical Society. Everybody's invited. All the people that Chris was describing, Marshall, Hamilton, etc. And what do? They get together and they discuss ideas. They discuss science. They discuss the latest technological achievements, etc. When the military academy was expanded around the War of 1812, the superintendent at that point is Joseph Gardner Swift, and he sends two top people, Thayer and McCree, to France. What are they going to do in France? Well, they go to the old French school for public works, which had been renamed the École Polytechnique and kind of turned into a military school, but it was not. It was never that. It was a school for public works. And they're given a budget, and they're told, bring back everything you can possibly get your hands on. They bring back 1,000 volumes. I forget how many crates it was, 90 crates or something like this. Every top technical scientific work of the top science and engineering to date. So by the time they bring that back, the West Point Military Academy has the largest and most extensive technological and scientific library anywhere in the Western world. That's the military academy. Okay, what else do? They don't just do that. Exactly at the same point, they set up I call it a crucible. If you know what a crucible really is, it's a container that melts metal, right? And people use it as a poetic idea, crucible, where, you can, under intensive conditions, you have to come up with a solution. And across the river from West Point, they set up, and I won't go through the details, it's absolutely fascinating. You can go visit the ruins today, and there's nice little plaques, etc. The West Point Foundry. And that becomes very much what, like Chris referenced with the Saugus Iron Works, the most intensive, productive kind of industrial park, if you will, definitely in North America, if not in all of the North America and Western Europe. It's a foundry. They produce obviously armaments, but it ends up producing all of the castings for the Erie Canal. There's nothing like it, and it creates the capability. And by the way, the West Point Foundry produced the first locomotives that were ever built in the United States. Stuff for the steamboats. Chris mentioned Rumsey and the steamboats. So then On top of that, they organized in the 1820s a newspaper called the New York Patriot, because you have this project comes under attack by America's enemies. They don't want us to do this. You know, the Wall Street types of the day don't want this. They don't want this idea of nation building. And so the Swift, Joseph Gardner Swift, one of the superintendents of West Point, along with people like James Fenimore Cooper, Washington Irving, they set this paper up to say, hey, look, we are going to fight till, whatever, to create an agricultural, manufacturing, full-set economy, and include in that a cultural renaissance of American literature, free from, the British so-called literature. And that's a whole other story. But they have a newspaper to defend the whole project. So without going through the details, the upshot of the whole thing is finally when Monroe becomes Secretary of War, because this is a military academy, so it's under the auspices of the Secretary of War, right? It's like Chris was saying, the populists, the states' right people were saying, because we wanted to use the military at that point, these trained engineers to go in to areas and survey them for canals, great projects, etc. And they said, you can't have the military coming into our state. We're not going to allow that. So there was a big constitutional issue, which Chris referenced. But what really changed it was when Monroe became president and something called the National Survey Act was passed in 1824. And that allowed the United States military to go into any part of the country and survey the terrain in extraordinary detail. To build a canal, to build a railroad, to build a road, to build a fortification or whatever. And so that exploded. I don't know why they call it this, but if you take your high school American history, whatever, they always call this the era of good feelings. Well, I guess we're building the nation and everybody has good feelings, but what it really was the era of the building of the country. And just between 1824, well, actually because they started the project before the General Survey Act, but over a 20-year period, over 100 West Point military engineers were produced, and they became the repository of engineering capability in the country. If we hadn't done that, if Hamilton, Washington, et cetera, had not had the foresight to do that, we never would have been able to build the nation. We built the Erie Canal with homegrown engineers, a lot of them that were educated by British engineers, English engineers, and it was a small number of people, and there's no way we could have possibly. I think between 1824 and 37, the West Point Board of Engineers, they surveyed over 120 projects, and these are huge projects like the Morris Canal, which is a canal all the way from the Hudson River to the Delaware River in New Jersey. And by that point, they then completely transformed the curriculum, where they put military science in together with the science of civil engineering. It was one single course. Science of war, civil engineering becomes one course. And there's other fascinating aspects of this, which we don't have time to really go through. But this is what builds the nation. It comes under attack when the states' rights, Jacksonian populists come in. We can't be spending all that money, and we don't want these guys coming in here telling us what to do. Well, the reason they didn't want that is because the Army Corps of Engineers guys were always right. They go in, they'd survey a project, to the last detail, they'd say, this is what the cost is going to be. It would be a lot. The local guys say, we don't want to spend all that money. We hired some local guys. They did another assessment, and we're going to go with that. Well, that happened with the case of the Baltimore and Ohio Canal. It was 30 years before it got finished, and it was because they were wrong. These private entrepreneurs were wrong, and the Army Corps of Engineer guys were correct. It didn't stop there, because you had, along the lines of what John Quincy Adams always contended, and the Founding Fathers too, this idea, the Declaration of Independence, and I'll kind of close this with, this is the famous July 4th, 1821 speech that John Quincy Adams gave on this. And he says, this Declaration of Independence was the first solemn declaration by a nation of the only legitimate foundation of civil government. It was the cornerstone of a new fabric destined to cover the surface of the globe. Wow. Look out, aristocracy. It demolished at a stroke the lawfulness of all governments founded upon conquest. It swept away all the rubbish of accumulated centuries of servitude. It stands and must forever stand alone, a beacon on the summit of the mountain to which all the inhabitants of the earth may turn their eyes for a genial and saving light, a light of salvation and redemption to the oppressed. And I'll just close with this. The first modern railroad built in Russia from Moscow to St. Petersburg was done completely, soups to nuts, by a West Point Military Academy engineering graduate, George Washington Whistler. He actually died there doing it in Russia in the 1850s. And we had the same type of, all throughout Latin America, you had Army Corps engineers out there building railroads, helping to develop these nations. And that's completely revolutionary. I don't know, maybe somewhere somebody can find some military of a major power over the centuries that did something like that. I don't think so. It's all soldiering and, mercenaries and, run by oligarchs and empires, or as Quincy Adams would say, governments founded upon conquest. But this military academy was based on building a nation. And I think I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Okay, we'll get to questions, and I'm going to pose a couple questions right away. Let me open up the queue here. Before I do, I want to just say something from Lyndon LaRouche's introduction to Graham Lowry's book, just to give you an idea about how the discovery process works, and why historical discovery and scientific discovery are one and the same thing. So here's what Lynn said. It is now over, this was written in 1987, okay? It is now a little over 3 years since historian Graham Lowry reported to me his discovery of what he then described to me as the missing link in the history of the American Revolution. During that meeting, he presented piece by piece proof that Benjamin Franklin and George Washington were both directly products of a transatlantic conspiracy centered around three leading international figures during the second half of the reign of England's Queen Anne. This is in the late 17th century. Gottfried Leibniz in Hanover, Jonathan Swift in London and Dublin, and Cotton Mather in Boston. Graham ticked off the most relevant pieces of evidence one after the other. Partway through his report, I became uneasy. I knew already of intellectual connections between Leibniz and Cotton Mather's circles, and Ben Franklin's indebtedness to Leibniz's circles for both Franklin's own scientific work and Franklin's leading role in assembling international political conspiracies for the American cause. The evidence for the role of Swift in this was also conclusive. The problem was that this by itself did not show how the pre-1763 mobilization of Americans for the Declaration of Independence had been organized directly around the specific ideas of Leibniz, Swift, Mather, Franklin, and so on. Then, smiling like a cat who had swallowed the canary, Graham presented the case of Alexander Spotswood, that great lieutenant governor of Virginia appointed by Queen Anne. It was Spotswood who had brought Virginia out of the intellectual backwater of a mere tidewater plantation settlement and transformed it into what became the state of our first presidents. The work and influence of Spotswood and his projects made the case a conclusive one. There was no longer a black hole of about 50 years' duration following 1688 in the history of the United States. Nearly 3 years of additional work had been needed to transform that original discovery into a book solidly presenting the case. Since I have been among those privileged to trace the progress of the manuscript over this period, I know how important the additional work in archives has been. He goes on like that. Now, that thing we just reported is our organization at its best. That's what we do. And why is that important right now? You cannot save the United States by electing, Donald Trump president. It will not do it. You cannot save the United States by changing some law or some person who represents somebody in the United States. You cannot save the United States by changing this or that judge on the Supreme Court. You can only save the United States by causing the people in the United States to rediscover who they are. Now, they can't do that just by doing history because a lot of people aren't competent to do it, although several of us are or learned how to do certain things. And there is that capability in this organization. What's relevant is this is the only way to reestablish electoral politics in the United States, which no longer has elections. Let me repeat that. You have a ceremony called elections. You have a pageantry called elections. You have sideshows called elections, but you do not have elections because you do not have a free government in the United States. You have not had a free government since September 11th, 2001. So in order to be able to get back to, and it wasn't that great a condition before 2001 either, but in order to be able to get back there, it will do you no good to alarm everyone and terrorize everyone and terrify everyone about how bad things are. That will do you no good. It's useful to talk about, and of course we have asserted, the extraordinary danger of thermonuclear war. We're very not only aware of it, we're very much involved in, as everybody knows who's on this phone call, and has been with our organization, in overhauling our entire organization over the past 2 years to focus the organization on an ability to intervene internationally in an effective and efficient way. We have reestablished that. That's why we are now moving to the next phase, which is to reestablish in the United States a capability of doing something about the United States, which did not exist for reasons that became abundantly clear between November 8th, I believe it was, of 2020, whenever the presidential election was. It may have been November 3rd, I may have the date wrong, and January 6th of 2021. Yeah, as of that period of time, the process went into the tank. We've had to reestablish that process, not in terms of our organization, in terms of the country. And so we've done that. Now there is an electoral campaign. There are several that are proposed, but there are a couple that now exist. And I won't say more about that here, but I think that this is something for people to consider and to think about. We're going to go to our questions. There is one question I want to pose, though, before Bob gets off. I think it's important. He talked about, Bob, you just talked about 1824 and what happened with this production of engineers and so forth. But that's also the same year, if I'm not mistaken, that Lafayette returned to America for a tour of the United States. He had been out for 50 years and that's the year in which John Quincy Adams was elected president. Is that correct? And if so, what's the relationship between those events and what you were describing?
Yeah, that's absolutely correct. The General Survey Act was actually passed while Monroe was still president, but the idea was the anticipation of 4 years, which is a battle, and that's a whole other story, but 4 years of the championing of all this, John Quincy Adams, for the next 4 years in the White House. And the Lafayette visit, I mean, that the whole idea of that was to reignite the spirit of the revolution in the United States. A lot of the American Revolutionary War veterans were dead by then. There were some that, of course, still living. So Lafayette came back to the United States, did a whole tour of it, and that was a key part. Again, mind you that this New York Patriot that I referenced, this newspaper, was also set up exactly the same time. So it's all part of a conspiracy, a grand conspiracy, to have a top-down revival of the American Revolution, and the General Survey Act was absolutely part of that, yeah.
Okay, very good. I'm going to go to the phones now. Let's see here. Okay, are you able to hear us?
Yes, hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah, a little bit of background noise, but probably if you speak up, it'll be all right.
Okay, I hope this is a little bit better. Excuse the background noise. I just stepped outside. My name's Jose, calling in from New York. You spoke about, Chris, you spoke about in the beginning that what the Founding Fathers did was a creation of government that was for the general welfare, as if to say that, the Constitution was a creation rather than just, something that was built upon experiences beforehand, right? That, yes, we did take things from people like Leibniz, Cotton Mather's, and so on and so forth, but ultimately the people who actually did this, the Founding Fathers, created something that was never seen. Now, when we talk about bringing this back today, does this mean that the Constitution is the be-all, end-all? Is there a way in which the future, people who, maybe years from now, might decide that there is something better, a document that's better to have the foundation of a country on? What do you think?
Well, I think that you'd have to have a far more educated, intelligent, enlightened population to ever trust that they would create a better constitution than the one that our founding fathers created. And that's why I shudder whenever anybody talks about altering the Constitution. Thank God that there is a certain high standard for amending the Constitution. And the amendments to the Constitution have been excellent, and in the spirit of the Constitution, by and large, except for maybe the term limits on the President of the United States. But, in general, I think this Constitution is really an excellent one, and we should, at this point, guard it with our lives, because it is the only thing in the United States that is standing in the way between us and absolute chaos and chaos and fascist tyranny that goes along with chaos. So that's my answer.
Well, if I may, Dennis, can I follow up or no?
Go ahead.
Well, wouldn't you say we already have a lot of fascism and tyranny right now? People have hijacked the government and are using it for their evil means. Just look at what we did to Afghanistan, to name one example, right? Under the name of the United States and, bending the Constitution to get away with these things. So I don't mean this as malice, of course, but what good is the document if it's not putting away the people who need to be put away, and it's allowing people like Schumer to be in the position that they're in? to let people like Bush get away with the evil things that they're doing.
But is the Constitution allowing that? Yeah, go for it, Bob.
Yeah, okay. This is an interesting story. So the guy that did the final draft, that was tasked with the final draft of the Constitution, name is Gouverneur Morris, which you, of course, Jose, know very, very well. And the big question was, well, what is it supposed to say at the very beginning? And I'm not talking about the preamble. I'm talking about, should it say, we, the Congress of the United States? No. He decided, and there was a consensus on this, we, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. You're the Constitution. I'm the Constitution. That the buck stops with the citizens of the United States. We, the people of the United States. So if we, the people of the United States, are letting all this crap go on, then we're the problem. And I think that's kind of what Chris also was getting at with the populism, et cetera. This is something that Lyndon LaRouche constantly, he lived this. Who's Lyndon LaRouche? Is he born into some wealthy family or, fame or fortune? No, he's just a guy from New Hampshire who decided he was going to use his life to change the course of history. You can't do that. Who do you think you are? Well, I'm the people. And that's my answer. And that was very consciously put in there with that idea in mind as the beginning of the Constitution.
What is always important to realize here is how degenerate the American people are. The thing that you presented is an expression of the degeneracy of the thinking of the American people, not just your own. The American people are completely degenerate. That is, that they are, for example, discussing transgender. Automatically, that disqualifies you from talking about the Constitution, frankly. Why? Well, because the idea of talking about something like that in the context of what the world's actual circumstance is, and the fact that, for example, the United States is no longer a self-sufficient nation, and that is to say, aspiring for not autarky, not absolutism, like being cut off from the rest of the world, but having, for example, full set industry in which you have a primarily productive workforce, which we do not have, in which universal public education is of the highest standard of any country in the world, and that these are conditions that are benchmark conditions without which you can't begin to discuss matters. While I do not think it should be illegal for people to vote or anything like that, I think that's all wrong to have that kind of discussion. Should we recognize that the notion that the Constitution is the basis for the actions of, for example, the State Department in Afghanistan, or any such thing, is on the face of it wrong. But that would only be if one had read the Constitution and understood it as the product of, an invention between the period of, not merely 1776 to 1787 to 89, though that could be said. So what was involved in inventing the Constitution? See, it's one thing, what is most infuriating is the way that people purport to be talking about something they have not bothered to even read or understand. So you can't separate the Constitution document from the deliberations of the Constitutional Convention. You can't actually know what that document says unless you know about the Constitutional Convention. So, for example, minimally, if you haven't read the Federalist Papers, you have no idea what the Constitution actually says. You don't know how those results were arrived at. It's like the people that want to talk about, isn't E equal MC squared racist because it comes from Einstein talking about the way in which he thinks that the universe works? I mean, that's only his view of how the universe works, isn't it? And see, that the point is you say, oh, no, that's not like that because it's a mathematical equation. No, actually, the situation of talking about E equals mc squared is less rigorous than talking about the Constitution. So that's just what people do. They play this game, and it's useful and it's important to call people on their game. In the United States, you cannot find you can find some colleges. We've done this experiment. This is how we know. When we've tried to get people to reading the Federalist Papers, and they can't read the words. Well, if you can't read and understand what the Federalist Papers say, how are you purporting to understand what the Constitution says? So the first thing you'd have to do before you even began to talk about whether or not you can change the Constitution, from my standpoint, is you'd have to pass the constitutional literacy test. And I think I would begin with the presidents and the Congress. So in this case, I would be for literacy tests, okay, for everybody. And then once you've passed that literacy test on the Constitution, by the way, what you'll find is that all kinds of people that were not born in this country and have been recent immigrants into the country can pass that test. And many of the people in this country can't. So just to say that. We're going to go back to the phones here. Got a couple of other people. Okay, can you hear us?
Yes. This is Tim in Leesburg. I just wanted to go back to the question that you had raised, Dennis, and that Bob answered in terms of this 1824 visit by Lafayette. One of the little-known elements of that is that Lafayette, when he came, sponsored the arrival to the United States of Friedrich List. It was via Lafayette that List came here, and List, threw himself for a number of years, for 5-6 years, into an incredible density of American system economic initiatives coming out of Philadelphia at the time. This, in a certain way, this paralleled what Franklin did, because Benjamin Franklin sponsored the arrival of Matthew Carey, a great Irish patriot, to the United States, who also set up in Philadelphia, directly working with Franklin, and then became one of the greatest of the printers of all the literature of the growing republic. And his son, Henry C. Carey, was the great economist of the middle part of the century, again, radiating American system economics all around the world. But I wanted to mention this Lafayette-Friedrich List connection because the recruitment of successive generations of people capable of absorbing and radiating the quality of the economics that were indispensable to our nation being able to survive and grow, etc., was an international matter. List, when he went back to Germany in the early 1830s, helped build the first railroad there. His writings on the American system were instrumental in Sergei Witte, the great Russian finance minister who sponsored the Trans-Siberian Railroad. And today, Helga LaRouche repeatedly stresses that Friedrich List is the most known foreign economist in China today. So the reason I bring this up and wanted to ask you further elaboration or comment on it, both you and Chris, is the fact that this is a totally international project where some remarkable people were brought in directly by people otherwise, someone like Franklin, of course, this was a global project in a certain way. The role that List played, brought in by Lafayette to then regenerate, as you said, a connection to the founding of the country, but push it forward. This cluster of people operating particularly out of Philadelphia at that point, I think the country was would not have survived without the density of this quality of person brought in an international recruitment effort. I think today the lesson is simply that this republic is not a territorial possession in any sense, but was created through efforts of an international conspiracy, and today it will be revived as part of an international conspiracy.
Any thoughts? You guys want to respond, or should we go on?
I'll just say briefly. I mean, it was always there. It was absolutely always there. I mean, a funny story is you talk about West Point. The reason the fort even existed there is because Washington Company smuggled in a bunch of French engineers before France had recognized us officially after the Battle of Saratoga. So this is before that, and they came in here and they basically built that fort and taught some of the American Continental Army personnel some engineering techniques, et cetera. So it was constantly that kind of international. And Dennis, of course, referenced the whole battle around Spotswood and expanding over the Appalachians, expanding and developing the whole continent. And what's that part of? It's part of the whole battle that Leibniz is involved in, not just within the British monarchy with Queen Anne and whatnot, but also Leibniz works with Peter the Great to set up the Academy of Sciences in Russia. He's involved with China in a very specific way. So it never really was anything but that. It's an extremely important element. But I have to say, the period that we're talking about, it's really a struggle. We're a very small country. We're not a power. And the power begins to develop going into the War of the Rebellion and then afterwards. And that's a whole other story, which at some point we could do a discussion on, because that's really where the American system becomes exported internationally. But, it's a very important element. I mean, the best of the best, and there's story upon story. There's Kosciuszko. I mean, we wouldn't have won the Battle of Saratoga without what Kosciuszko did in terms of actually designing the fortifications there, et cetera. And he was a Republican from Poland, came over here and said, "Hey, I want to volunteer." So, anyway, enough said. But absolutely, that's true.
Okay, very good. We'll go back to the phones. Okay, you able to hear us?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you're all right.
Okay, thanks. This is Kynan in Queens, and thank you, Chris and Bob, for your wonderful presentations. But I had a question directed at you, Bob, and I know this may seem like it's coming out of left field, but it comes back to the tour that you gave of the Gettysburg site just this last Saturday, which I thought was extraordinary, and it was great to be there. But in particular, the thing that you went through as to how the Union won that battle and how that turned the tide for the rest of the war was the difference in mindset between the Union forces and Confederate forces, and this strategy that you called Auftragstaktik, which I hope I'm pronouncing correctly, in that you get your orders, from the commander, your top commander, but that you have a mission, and that maybe if something goes wrong in that battle, you have to decide strategically what you're going to do. And you're not going to wait for whoever the other commander is to tell you what to do. But you have to do it. You have to decide right there. And that was different for the Confederacy in that it was hierarchy which determined all these things. And they weren't willing to mobilize all their forces when the time was right. And this goes back to your presentation on how West Point was founded, and that it just simply wasn't a military academy, but they were forming a new scientific renaissance because they were teaching all these different subjects, and they had gone internationally to discover, to bring back the best of the books, the best of the literatures, to actually form this scientific elite. And my question is, if it hadn't been for that development which went into West Point, which started under Hamilton and George Washington, would you have gotten this military that was able to think as they did in the Civil War under the Auftrag Taktik that you mentioned? I hope that's clear. That's my question.
Well, that's a fascinating question because that's something I actually wondered about, because this came out of the Auftrag Taktik conception came out of the friends of Friedrich Schiller, at the turn of the century. Von Eisenhower, von Stein, all these guys. We've written a lot about this. I always wondered, was this somehow brought into the curriculum? Was this taught somehow at West Point, et cetera? And I don't know the answer to that, if that was taught directly, because it was definitely taught as a military idea, in the Prussian Military Academy, which is why probably be controversial, but honestly, it's why the Wehrmacht was a hell of a lot better of a military force in the Second World War than we were. They were just under the wrong side. So, right, but they were actually, in terms of we won that war with logistics and depth, the American system. We didn't win it because of great military competence. So that's a pretty well-known fact. I don't think it's that controversial. But I think, honestly, I thought about it, and then I was thinking, well, it really didn't matter, because it's kind of a natural thing that develops if you have a higher moral purpose. And remember the stories I talked about with Strong Vincent, Joshua Chamberlain. These people, Abraham Lincoln, he's the best one. These people have absolutely no military experience whatsoever, but they're animated by the mission to preserve this form of government for all of mankind. I mean, it's very clear in their mind that if we lose it here, it's gone. The great experiment is over, and that mankind descends into hell, into a dark age. And they're animated by that, and that then allows you to create these miracles, if you will. So I think it's a natural development out of the moral mission of the United States. I hope that's clear, because it definitely was that way with the Prussians. Again, these are the circles of Schiller, et cetera. So they're operating from a higher conception of mankind. They have a mission, and that's my view of it. I don't think you could have the Auftrag Taktik in an oligarchical society in an oligarchical imperial army. It just doesn't exist. Why would it? Soldiers are there because they're professional soldiers. They want to get paid. They don't have a higher moral mission. They don't even think of that. So the idea of being a citizen, we the people, and there you are as a private, and there's anyway, in the Union Army or whatever, a corporal, a captain, whatever rank you may be, it doesn't matter. You can be animated by that idea, and then pursue the principle. So I think it's a natural Republican, smaller idea that would kind of like naturally occur with the mission of the country. So I hope that kind of answers it.
Okay, very good. We'll continue to move on here. We have other people in the queue. Let's go to the next one. Okay, are you able to hear us?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, you're clear.
Okay, just a comment I wanted to make in terms of this last issue, which is often forgotten because it's just not generally known by people, is that the actual advisor to the Prussian military who created this legacy of a humanistic approach was Moses Mendelssohn. And this happened before even Schiller was born, or just when he was a child. He was the man known as the Socrates of Europe, and he was brought in, I forget by which military leader, to be an advisor and how to train the Prussian military. But in the course of that, there's a very fascinating footnote in the book that he wrote during the 18th century, middle of the 18th century. He was older than Schiller, which is called Jerusalem, where he has a fascinating footnote in there where he reports that he wrote a letter to the founders of the United States. I guess it must have been during the American Revolution, 1776 or something like that when it started. Again, I haven't really researched this, but he has a footnote there saying that when you write the Constitution, do not make the kind of error that the European countries fall into of declaring yourself a Christian nation. You shouldn't put a name on what you mean by religious freedom, because all of the European countries have official religions. And he said the United States should not have an official religion. It should have a principle governing the relationship between religion and government, but not an official religion. So it's a very interesting crossfire of developments, which is generally not even known. And he was actually the original root of this connection between the Schiller circles and the Prussian military. And it is worth saying because people have a very profiled view of Germany, and it should look at all it should be aware of how Carnot was thrown out of France and was actually spent many years in exile in Germany. I think he was even originally buried there, and they eventually moved his corpse back to France. So this really was an international effort to get these ideas out.
Okay. There's a few in the queue. Okay, so we're going to keep going here for a minute. Okay. All right. Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
I'll be brief. Just on this question of morale, Chris and I watched. It's Diane Sare, LaRouche candidate for U.S. Senate in New York. But I wanted to just share my observations. I had suspected it would be the case because in the Russian special military action to denazify Ukraine, that there would be a certain kind of morale because they are taking such great pains to not kill civilians and to act, frankly, with love toward the population there, which is being terrorized on both sides by these Nazis or this, minority Nazi population, which, as people know, people who have terroristic personalities end up being the dominant factor because people who are kind people and good people don't act that way. So we have been watching this character, Patrick Lancaster, who is an American soldier who was in the Donbass for a number of years and who does what I find the most interesting are not his exact military about what was bombed and not, but his interviews with the population. And in this case, he's interviewing soldiers from Chechnya who have been involved in liberating Metalsink or something, one of the little towns securing the end of the Donbass. And he's walking along and says, "Oh, I smell death, I smell death." And they come across a sort of a nest of dead Ukrainian soldiers. And he's talking to the Chechen soldiers who have liberated and secured the area to get these fighters out of there, who've been shelling and killing civilians and using civilians as shields and so on. And what the soldiers say, their demeanor is completely calm, and they just say, "Look, we tried to get them to surrender. If anyone surrenders, they are not humiliated, they are not tortured, we will treat them well, and when we are done with our action, they will be returned to their relatives." But they are under orders not to surrender, and if they insist on trying to kill us, basically, and keep fighting, then we have to do this. I don't know if it's coming across, but it was just striking. These were not, maybe the oldest guy who was the sharpshooter who was sort of in charge of the operation was in his early to mid-40s. The other ones were 20s, 30s, but it was just extremely calm. And they said, we didn't come here to kill people. That's not what we want to do here. We have a specific task. When it's done, we're leaving. And the Russians have taken a lot of casualties because they are trying so hard to just eliminate the Nazis without hitting all of the, civilians that they are using for shields. So it's sort of an example, I think, of that kind of situation that you saw, if you want to go back to the War of the Rebellion or other cases where you have a certain higher moral authority, which gives people enormous courage and strength, and also an ability to absorb massive losses. Because if they were going to just, they don't have to be losing all these lives. If they wanted to take over Ukraine, as people say, they could have just leveled the place and bombed it remotely. That's not what they're doing. That's all.
Okay. Okay, thank you very much. You guys want to say anything about that, or should we just continue?
No, that's clear, I think.
Okay. All right. Very good. Okay. Okay. Are you able to hear us?
Yes.
Okay. You might have to speak up a little bit. It was a little bit faint.
Okay, I'll try. How's that?
That's better.
Okay, this is Rick Sanders. I want to point out that these two people, I forget their names, who were chosen to go to France from West Point and get all those books, I think that's very important, because the reason they had to get those books, there were two reasons. One is that the French École Polytechnique at the time was by far the most advanced in geometry, particularly relating to military, but also geometry, what they called constructive geometry or synthetic geometry, which is not taught anywhere in the West today, and it's because it's much superior. But the Germans picked it up in Göttingen. Anyway, the British, of course, had won, so they were about to steal or burn, basically burn all those books. So it was very important for us. It's LaRouche used to talk about, we didn't develop it enough, the difference between continental science and British science. British science stinks. It's completely reductionist, with a few exceptions that we know, but it's just pretty awful, as you can tell today. So, but continental science has treasures in it, which we, because of British influence here, we haven't developed. So when you say geometry, the way it's taught here, it's a terrible thing. It's an awful thing. But if you say geometry, synthetic geometry, it's a beautiful thing. So this is something that we have to explore more, because it's what it's wonderful, and in fact, there was one geometer in Germany who learned this, who said, I can solve any problem in algebra with geometry and do it much faster and much easier. So that would be a very nice thing.
Okay, good, very good. I'm going to keep going here. And at any point, you guys can respond to any of these or all of these. This may be our last question. Or yeah, can you hear us?
Yes, hi. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, hi. This is Janet West in Leesburg. And just a quick comment. I was really happy to hear about the tour of Gettysburg, because that's been one of my favorite spots. I wrote an article several years ago called The Battles of Gettysburg and Vicksburg, How the American System Economics Won the Civil War, or Auftragstaktik, American style. So yes, indeed, it was American system economics that helped to win the Civil War, that the North had mass production of rifles, whereas the South, they hand-made each rifle, so you couldn't even change the parts if you needed to. But the whole mentality in the South was basically of backwardness. And so both General Meade at Gettysburg and also Lee at Vicksburg took advantage of that. They knew how the enemy thought. And, when I looked at Gettysburg, what struck me was, excuse me, that several times the Confederates actually did have the upper hand militarily. And then time after time after time, someone would, pass the buck or literally say, no, I'm not going to follow up. I'm going to go to bed. It's too late. So time after time after time, the commanders in the Confederacy refused to take leadership, to take responsibility, whereas in the North, you had leadership reflected from the commanders on down to the average person. In Vicksburg, Grant knew how the Confederates were thinking, so he just basically ran circles around them, set up tricks, played tricks on them, outflanked them constantly. Just one story real quick. Grant was crossing into Mississippi, crossing his entire army into the enemy territory, so he had diversions run where some cavalry troops went from the Vicksburg area into the interior and then south to kind of meet up with Grant. And they dressed like Confederates, so they were kind of undercover. And it was just, a few soldiers, and they marched up to a fort run by the Confederates, and they said, we hereby command you to surrender to General Grant. And the Confederates panicked. They didn't know what to do, and so the Union forces had time to hightail it out of there during that time. So yes, the American system of economics, but also the notion of the fight for the Union came first, was primary, not the individual state represented, but the Union. So that was very much it. Thank you.
Hey, Janet, when was your article written, by the way?
Well, I think it was, 2018. It's in the Schiller Institute. I think it's schillerinstitute.com. It's in the archive. But I can, if anyone sends me an email, I can certainly forward it to them. Happy to.
Okay, just wanted to make sure. And can you just announce the title again, because there are a couple of people that are probably still connected or thinking about it.
Oh, okay. The full is kind of long. The full title is The Battles of Gettysburg and Vicksburg: How American System Economics Won the Civil War, or Auftragstaktik, American Style. And I dedicated the article to Alan Salisbury because he was one of the people who inspired me to start investigating American history.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I have to say, thanks a lot, Janet, because I definitely went back and reviewed your article, and that's kind of where I got the idea of to make that the theme of the tour. So it's a great article, and you can get it right on the Schiller Institute archive site. But anyway.
Yeah, let me just, since you're now talking about, let's because we can wind up now, then this is good. And if there's any other matters that you guys would want to respond to, or any points you'd like to make at this point, and then we'll conclude. We'll start with you, Bob. Bob, are you there? I mean, he's not there. Okay, Chris, are you able to hear me?
Yeah. Yep. Well, I mean, two things come to mind from what Janet said. It's you think about the people at Gettysburg who risked and who gave everything or risked everything to save the Republic. That's something that every citizen in the United States should think about right now. Would you be willing to do the same thing? Would you be willing to risk your life for the actual idea of saving this republic. And I shudder to think that most Americans really don't even understand why this nation would be worth risking your life to save. I mean, it's ironic because people go off to war, all the time. They go to Iraq, they go to Libya, they go to wherever. But in terms of actually understanding the United States Republic, I mean, it's a precious thing. And one thing I wanted to say also in terms of what Tim was bringing up in terms of this international question, I think there's a really excellent video that was put out about Revive the American System with Chinese Characteristics. It was created by Peter Muller, and it's on our website. If you just search on the website American System with Chinese Characteristics, the video will come up. We had a similar video, 1932, that unfortunately we can't put up on our website. The point is that if you look at Tony Chaikin has done a lot of work on this too. When the United States system, the American system, was spreading all over the planet, this was an absolute nightmare for the British Empire. This was what the founders of our nation intended. This is what John Quincy Adams intended. That this would spread. This is what Lincoln intended. It would spread all over the world, not through military might, but through economic development, very much along the lines of what the Chinese are doing right now. It's important to think about. The Chinese are more American by far than the United States is right now in terms of what they are actually doing. They are carrying on the idea and the tradition of the American system of political economy in developing the world. And ironically, of course, they're looking to the United States to work with them to do that. We continually kick them in the teeth. But there was a time where that was the United States had that mission, and the British organized war, World War I and other wars, to destroy and disrupt that. And I think people should reflect on that now, because every time you get the potential for something seemingly so beautiful and so obvious as the United States, Russia, China, India, other nations working together on peaceful cooperation, it gets blown apart by machinations of the British Empire, pitting nation against nation, and people, the American population is falling for this again and again. So I think it's really critical that the American people study the history of this nation, and that's our mission. That's what we're going to have to do. Is that's this pamphlet that we put out, the future of America on the New Silk Road. The history section in that, and then the economic development sections in that. If we can get that circulating and really, really challenge the American, challenge your neighbor, challenge young people to look at the American history, because it's definitely something to be proud of. And people don't know that, but it's absolutely something to be proud of. And they don't know what it is that they could be proud of. That's the tragedy. But if we can get that across, we can revive that spirit again in this country. We can save the nation, especially with incredible campaigns, that people are running right now, which we have endorsed. So, and hope that we'll see more candidates running in that spirit in the future.
Bob, are you there?
Yeah.
Yeah, if you have anything.
Just quickly, I just would like to close on this kind of a sub-theme, or really maybe it's not such a sub-theme, but this idea of the responsibility of the citizen. I think there are lots of Americans today that are willing to put their lives on the line, but they just don't know what they're putting their lives on the line for. And the problem is what LaRouche used to always talk about, popular opinion. They don't like to think. They're completely swayed by, what their neighbors think, what their boss thinks, what their wife thinks or doesn't, whatever. And that's what we're really battling about, and that's the whole point of the campaigns that we're running, et cetera. So I just want to underscore that theme. Now, just finally, also, the LaRouche organization is going to initiate a whole project on this, on the history of the country, which Chris and I will be involved in. So we're going to be producing videos, regular discussions, et cetera. So this is the beginning of an ongoing discussion, which obviously we'll make access to, or we'll make accessible to as many people as possible.
I think what we should say here is that this is the initiation of that process, but it's not different than what we did on Sunday. That is that the ad hoc committee for a new Bretton Woods system is our implementation of the intent of the Constitution and Declaration of Independence. It's a very specific proposal that Helga Sepp-LaRouche wrote up, but it is the intervention that would have been made by Hamilton or others, but done in the way that they would have expected. What do I mean? There is no reason to make a political revolution in the institutions of the United States government. The reason is the United States, the institution of the United States government is the preamble and the Declaration of Independence, not anything else. Even including the Constitution's specific articles, that is not the institution of the United States government. The institution of the United States government is the Declaration of Independence, and particularly the first part of it, and the preamble to the Constitution, as these documents make it very clear. That they're very clear about it, right? That when a long train of abuses or usurpations pursuing invariably the same object evinces a desire to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government. But that's not a question of a form. If you know that you've got, as has happened since 9/11, a dictatorship running the United States through a coup, then throw it off. What do you use to do that? The institution of the government of the United States, the Declaration of Independence in the preamble. But you have to do it. As opposed to this, why don't we get together and do something about the Constitution? Oh, no. That's like a bunch of skateboard, repairmen saying they're going to work on a Mercedes. No, the first thing you ought to do is learn how a Mercedes operates, all right? And then what you do is talk about, okay, let's see if there's something that we can do that can make this run better. No problem. That's a good idea. And so this is what we have to insist on at this point in our country. I think what we can do, and certainly we can make it done through our Thursday discussions. We could certainly have a once monthly or maybe more frequent fireside chat devoted to this sort of theme and build that. Probably be a very useful thing to do, particularly for younger people in the United States that have no ability to even get an exposure. I mean, of course, you can go and find this or that video or whatever, but that's not really what's necessary. I think tonight was very useful also from the interactive side standpoint. So if those sorts of things are things that people would like to see happen, please let us know. Write to us. You can write to Bob or to Chris specifically. You can also follow different elements of this. Already been mentioned that the Schiller Institute site is doing that. We are also doing periodically the historical tours, and I have the sense that there are other activities, particularly in the New York area, that are going to be available for people to participate in this regard. So I want to thank everybody for joining us tonight, and just say, of course, there'll be the Saturday presentation, Manhattan Town Meeting presentation, We expect Harley Schlanger to be with us, maybe a couple of others. We'd like to get Mike Robinson, but he may have a schedule conflict from Britain. But notice that we didn't say anything about Boris Johnson because there's so little to Boris Johnson that we decided to like not to say anything. Yes, it's the kind of thing, however, we may be able to have further commentary on Saturday. So just want to invite everybody to tune into that show on Saturday. All right, so we're going to conclude for this evening, and we'll see you here again next week. Please start to do the work with the ad hoc committee, circulating that declaration, otherwise called the petition that's being going out on a new Bretton Woods.